Oh, I do see that chat's open. Welcome. Rose will put a link to a poll in the chat, and if you are able and willing, please answer the poll. Tell us why you are taking this webinar. Is it for personal knowledge or for professional use, or for both personal and professional use? It's like mostly personal and professional use. Thank you everyone for sharing about that. Rose Pogoshnik will be our webinar producer. You can ask for advice for tech issues or monitoring the chat box or providing links in the chat if there's anything that you need. So today's webinar is titled Unpacking Legislation Aimed at Transgender Youth. My name is Jenifer McGuire. I'm a professor and an extension specialist at the University of Minnesota. I'm housed in the Department of Family Social Science, and my background is in adolescent development, well-being, and my research is predominantly focused on LGBT youth with a strong focus on transgender youth. I'd like to acknowledge some of the sources that have helped me in preparing this talk. For starters, there's some really great legislative trackers at the Minnesota House and Senate, the Human Rights Campaign, and Freedom for All Americans. There's a new legislative tracker too, which will be mentioned in a later slide. Thank you for colleagues of mine who've helped with policy brief development. We had a policy brief that was released last year. Kate Kubalanka, Jessica Fish, Russ Toomey, Christina Olson, and Laura Baums. And thank you to the professional societies I'm a member of who have supported this work and have maintained a stance of advocacy against the onslaught of anti-transgender laws. So state legislators across the country are considering bills that are designed to limit the rights for transgender youth access to bathrooms, sports, activity, and age-appropriate medical care. This webinar will examine national trends in those anti-transgender laws, Minnesota's proposed legislation for the recently passed session, and how the efforts impact the well-being of transgender youth. So at the end of this webinar, we will hope that participants have learned to identify the major trends in anti-transgender legislation, that participants can identify mechanisms for how to become informed about legislative efforts nationally, and participants can learn about the impacts of legislation and efforts to pass legislation on the well-being of transgender and gender non-conforming youth. So we have a long history of anti-LGBT legislation in this society, and one of the sort of first and biggest of the very specifically anti-LGBT laws was Colorado Amendment 2 back in 1992. And after that time, there have been multiple anti-marriage amendments, including the Defense of Marriage Act in the late 90s and other sorts of amendments designed to restrict the rights of LGBT people in marrying. Once marriage was settled through a court case, there became a huge shift to anti-transgender legislation that focuses specifically on the rights and activities of transgender youth and adults. So these have focused on bathroom bills, which have to do with which bathroom or locker room someone can be in. Do you have to be in the bathroom or locker room based on your assigned sex at birth or how you identify? Is it a criminal act to be in a bathroom? Can anyone enforce a perceived slight of the wrong bathroom use? Voting rights are another major component of focus on anti-transgender legislation, and voting rights span other minority groups as well. But for transgender people in particular, both through the increased risk of poverty within this population, but also the need to change identification documents, voting rights can become at risk when voter ID requirements are put into place because someone may not have identification yet that legally matches their name to their appearance. Sports participation bans have been largely focused on trans girls and limiting their access to women's sports. And they take a lot of forms, but that's been the gist of their legislation. Medical care is predominantly about reducing gender affirming care and access to gender affirming care, and it has spanned a lot of different strategies for that, which would include making it illegal to provide gender affirming medical care, making it a criminal act for doctors to provide gender affirming medical care, making it a criminal act to go to another state for gender affirming care, making it impossible for insurance to cover gender affirming medical care, reducing the military's coverage of medical care. So there have been dozens of efforts and bills proposed at reducing medical care, both for kids and for adults. I should say, if you have a question, please feel free to put it in the chat while we're talking, and Rose or someone will notify me that there's a message in the chat. So one of the risks about legislation that focuses specifically on transgender populations is that it does not specifically only hurt transgender people, right? So hurting transgender people in and of itself is a problem, and legislation that is aimed specifically at trans people also hurts other marginalized populations. So for instance, voting rights acts are a good example, where they may be designed to limit trans access to voting, but a lot of other people have limited access to voting when those laws get put in place. Bathrooms are another example. So limiting the rights of trans people to use the bathroom can have impacts for other people who might need to use the bathroom, or caregivers who need to use the bathroom with the person they're caring for, or parents and children who need to use bathrooms. So conversely, policies that support one group of marginalized people can often help multiple groups of marginalized people. So for instance, having private gender neutral bathrooms in more places, or in places where bathrooms are one stall anyway, allowing them to be unigender so that anyone can use them, that can help everyone. It can help a parent with a child, it can help somebody with a caregiver, it can help a trans person, it can help a variety of people. And so the same is true with sports participation. Things that enhance sports participation for trans girls are likely to enhance sports participation for lots of other people as well, by reducing some of the barriers to access. The current wave of legislation that is in this past year, the focus has been on a variety of different things. One is medical care, and that's including puberty suppression, gender affirming hormones, as well as surgeries prior to 18 or even prior to age 26 in some cases, bathroom and locker room use. And these legislative efforts are often termed respect for privacy. And so they are focused on, allowing for the privacy of people of a certain assigned sex in one or the other of the locker rooms. Limiting sports participation, and these are focused predominantly on trans girls. And so they tend to talk about preserving women's sports participation by engaging in an essentialist biological approach to who is a girl. There's a mix of legislation out there proposing and or restricting conversion therapy. So for the most part, conversion therapy legislation is proposed to oppose it, and to oppose it for people under 18. Some legislation allows for religious exemptions. So for instance, if there's an anti-discrimination bill in place, then they might say, well, you don't have to engage in anti-discrimination efforts if you are a religious organization that views being transgender as wrong. And so that's another way, or you don't have to serve a person in a business if you don't accept their sexual orientation or gender identity. And finally, there are don't say gay ordinances. And these are I see a typo. These are, I would say this is the kind of most popular new ones. These were around for a while in the early 2000s, and then they kind of stepped back and they've resurfaced. And don't say gay ordinances have to do with in schools not providing any information, imagery, visuals or context related to sexual orientation or gender identity. So saying nothing about who anyone is, not ever saying like if somebody has two same-sex parents, not mentioning that, not disclosing sexual orientation of anyone, and not teaching about anything to do with gay or transgender history. Okay, there's a few different ways to stay involved. For many years, there was an organization called the Freedom for All Americans, which was tracking anti-transgender legislation and with a specific goal of promoting the Equality Amendment, which we'll talk about a little bit later. The Equality Amendment is the goal of it. It's a national amendment to make discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity illegal at the federal level. Currently, it is not illegal to discriminate against someone for being LGBT or trans, and it is in Minnesota, but it is not federally. So, for instance, a federal employee could potentially be fired because they're gay, or somebody could be denied access to an apartment to rent because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. There's a new legislative tracker around, which is called the translegislation.com. And these links are here, and I'm happy to share the slides if people want them. And this one is focused specifically on anti-trans legislation and has really good details about what's happening in every state. The Human Rights Campaign has resources about laws and legislation. And then we have our own state legislation tracker in Minnesota. And I'll cover a little bit how to find the legislation, any legislation that we have, and how to search on it and kind of see what it says. Okay, so we were actually having a bit of an improvement in LGBT rights. So 2015 had been our worst year. There were the most ever. There were 125 bills tracked, and 21 of them were anti-trans in 2015. And so as we look through the timeline, then there was a bit of a lull in these kinds of bills being proposed. So anti-trans marriage, a discrimination carve out, bathroom and locker rooms, and prisoner health care were the ones that were proposed in 2015. From 2016 to 2020, there was a lull and fewer of those were proposed. However, in 2021, 250 anti-LGBT laws were introduced in 2021. And so 35 bills prohibiting transgender youth affirming medical care, 69 bills prohibiting trans youth sports participation, 43 bills allowing religious belief as a justification to not engage in non-discrimination, and 15 bills prohibiting trans people from having access to restrooms or locker rooms. So that was 2021. And I think what's notable is the way that this kind of legislation starts to peak when there's a government in place that is supportive of transgender equality and queer equality. And so when those more supportive governments are in place, the opposition government or the government that's not in power will propose a lot of these anti-LGBT bills, in part as a way to motivate their base and to get people interested and involved and to do things. So that's just a really noticeable trend that in 2015 we had a queer affirming government, and for 4 years we did not, and there was a relative lull in anti-LGBT bills, and then as soon as we had a more queer affirming government back in place, we saw the rise in these bills at the state level again. So there's an ebb and flow. Okay, now in 2023, so I'll go back quickly. In 2021, there were 250. That was like the biggest, worst year ever. Now, 2023, there were 556 bills in 49 of the 50 states, and 80 of them passed over the past year. These can be tracked at translegislation.com, and the past bills have to do with a large number of them are gender affirming care bans. There's a locker room or bathroom use. Things that don't say gay, or educational bills limiting sports participation and limiting the alteration of birth certificates to a new name or gender, and religious exemptions for discrimination. Thank you. Rose posted the link to this in the chat. This is a really nice new website that is new here since the last time I did this webinar a year ago, when we were talking about 2022. Well, it was just still in 2022 when I did it. So it's been 2 legislative cycles since I did this webinar. Okay, so 2023 also saw a new trend, which was the introduction of federal anti-transgender bills. So this is brand new, starting in 2023. There were 27 bills proposed at the federal level they involved limiting military participation and limiting military coverage of transgender health benefits, limiting gender-affirming care, placing trans women in men's prisons, insisting that trans women be in men's prisons, saying that teachers cannot support trans kids. So this is an element of the Don't Say Gay, but it's not exactly the same. So making it a criminal offense for a teacher to call a student by their stated pronouns and to not tell their parents. And a law of that nature has passed in Texas. The Don't Say Gay laws, and then got laws limiting sports participation. Thankfully, at the federal level, none of these have passed yet. Minnesota. So I know that we often think of Minnesota as sort of a refuge for transgender young people and for their care. And that is true, especially given some of our neighbors. There were still 11 anti-trans bills introduced in 2023. And for reference, in 2022, there were 4. And in 2021, I think there were 2 or 3. So you can find these at the trans legislation bills. There's a map of the US, and you can click on your own state, but there's also a link here in the slide. There's healthcare, the bills that are introduced are healthcare, sports, bathrooms, Don't Say Gay, drag show limits. And then we also had the anti-conversion therapy, which is not a anti-trans bill. So it's not listed on that webpage. It's a supportive bill. I have listed here the numbers of the bills that were posted. And the reason for that is because you can go look each of these up at the Minnesota legislation website. So back in one of the earlier slides, there's a link to the Minnesota State Senate and House Committee legislative reports. And you can, if you have the right number, you can link them in. You can just search on these bills and then look for what they actually say. The risk is when you go in there to search, if you search based on content, you will not find it. And so a lot of things are worded in really awkward and double negative ways, so that unless you really know what they're getting at, you won't necessarily notice that it's anti-trans. And so that's why having the list of the numbers of what's been proposed has been really important in terms of searching in the Minnesota House and Senate. Ones that say HF are House legislation, ones that say SF are Senate legislation. And thankfully, none of these bills made it even into committee. They were all introduced in the past year, but they weren't sent to committee. Okay, so there is a push and pull of supports and restrictions. We have a refuge bill that has been introduced and passed in Minnesota, which I'll get to on the next slide. However, it doesn't limit the ongoing introduction of other restrictions. So for instance, our refuge bill has said that we are a supportive place for trans youth to come for gender affirming medical care, and that we will not allow for, we won't cooperate with states who are trying to prosecute people who've come here for medical care. And it also includes for abortion care. But at the same time, someone else can still propose and introduce legislation that that says, the Don't Say Gay bills or anti-bathroom use, things like that. So you can't, having one strong supportive law doesn't necessarily end the onslaught of the many thousand little needles of other legislative efforts. Our anti-conversion therapy bill was passed this year alongside the refuge bill, and it established the protection from conversion therapy. So there was no healthcare professional shall engage in conversion therapy with a client younger than 18 years of age or with a vulnerable adult. So this was passed and signed into law during this past session. I am missing a slide. Oh, here it is, Minnesota transgender protections. Okay, sorry, it skipped over it. We passed and signed the protections for transgender persons in Minnesota. So there was a trio of proposals, and they were aimed at legally safeguarding people who came to Minnesota for abortion or for gender affirming care, and outlawing what's called conversion therapy for minors. So this passed just in April, so it's really only been about 6 weeks, and there's a great article describing it. There's a link to that in this slide as well that explains kind of what all is covered in the new protections. Oh, and so this is why, right? I thought I was in the wrong order. So the push-pull of supports and restrictions are that the protections and the supports are really important, and there continues to be this push against trans young people. The Equality Act is an act that would provide consistent and explicit non-discrimination protections for LGBT people across key areas of life, including employment, housing, credit, education, public spaces and services, and federally funded programs and jury duty. We in Minnesota, and as well as in about 17 states, have a statewide protection for anti-discrimination for LGBT people, but many states don't. And so as you may have been witnessing, states that don't have those protections in place become even more vulnerable when a bill is introduced and passed that restricts the rights of LGBT people, because they can't fall back on their Equality Act. So this is establishing the 14th Amendment, but specifically for LGBT persons, the equal protections under the law. So next we'll get to, so that's the summary of kind of what happened this legislative session, was that really a lot happened this legislation, and we're now in unprecedented territory of about 20 states have passed anti-gender affirming care bans. And so even when laws don't progress, they impact society. And when they do progress, they impact society even more. So children, so in a state like Minnesota, children can hear their identities or their parents' identities being debated. So people talk about kids with two parents or being trans. They hear hate speech and rhetoric that is anti-trans or LGBT is increased when there are bills presented and being debated. And there's an increase in documented hate crimes, specifically for LGBT persons, when we see more legislation in action. And so, for instance, anti-trans hate crimes are of the hate crimes that are documented. That's one of the most significant of the hate crimes is towards people who are transgender. And so they're already one of the most victimized group, but that victimization goes up when there's legislation introduced. Legislation can have a chilling effect. So we already see disparities in mental health and concerns, including anxiety, depression, and suicidality for trans young people. And there also are school climate concerns and hate crimes and verbal assaults. So when there's legislation that seeks to limit the rights of any population, but specifically for transgender young people, all of those disparities grow. So there become spikes in anxiety and depression, and there become increases in suicide attempts and suicidality. It becomes harder to manage school climate issues when there are laws in place, or even discussion of laws in place that say you shouldn't be talking about gay issues. So then all of a sudden, if someone is harassed for being gay, they don't have any recourse to go to the principal or go to a teacher and ask for help if it's against the law to even discuss and to even discuss sexual orientation. And then again, like I said before, there's an increase in hate crimes when legislation is moving forward, and an increase in verbal assaults. And we're hearing that anecdotally already coming from some of the states that have passed anti-transgender legislation in this past session. The other thing that specifically that it does with regard to the limitations of medical care are that it reduces access to what is really a life-saving and critically important and developmentally appropriate form of medical care for people from certain parts of the country, but not other parts. And so it really can reduce their long-term well-being because they haven't had access to this care that's been scientifically supported for some time now. There are some things that you can do to support trans young people. The first one you can do is to stay informed. So clicking on those links that went into the chat and following Human Rights Campaign, following the Trans Legislation Tracker, kind of know what's going on, especially in your own state. Contact your representative or other representatives. So the reason I say contact other representatives, so my representatives, I have great representatives. They're already all over this. They don't really need to hear from me about how important this is to me. They already know that. And they're not the ones who are trying to introduce anti-trans legislation or trying to limit trans opportunities. And so there are other representatives in the state who are doing those things. And so your time might be better spent contacting a different representative rather than kind of preaching to the choir of somebody who already values the importance of equity and equality. Communicate your support for an evidence-informed approach to legislation. So the thing about all of the legislation that was introduced this year and that passed, it didn't have anything to do with the science. It was in the face of the science. And a number of us who are scientists in this area have written policy briefs. We've testified before subcommittees. We've talked to the media. And the legislators who are passing this kind of legislation simply do not care about the science and are motivated to pass legislation that harms trans people because it furthers their own political desires. So that has been an important thing, is for even people who aren't involved specifically in trans issues and don't necessarily have a personal link to it, just communicating your support that legislation should be based on science and should be based on the evidence that we have about what is supportive and successful for young people. Does anyone have any questions? I realize we are going to finish a little bit early, but I think you could put your questions into the chat and I'm going to go to the rest of the slides and then I'll stop sharing so that we can chat as needed. There are some final details there's an evaluation. If you would like a certificate of participation for this webinar, you can click on the evaluation link. And if you would like well-being points, then same thing, click on the evaluation points, and then they're added to you. You have to follow the link to request points at the end of the evaluation. Oh, I see something in the chat. Nope, just more links. And there we have some more upcoming webinars this summer in May through August. We have 9 different series and there are 31 total webinars. So we have a series in Spanish. We have some on finding balance, which are mental health and well-being, parenting, climate and disaster preparedness, making sense of it all. So financial management, recovery and health, which is substance abuse focused, what's for dinner, a nutrition series, no place like home, which is housing and home development, and then family-friendly earth care, which is climate and family. If you'd like to engage further with Extension, we have links to Instagram, Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, YouTube, and a LinkedIn page. I see in the chat some questions, so I'll leave these links. Well, I'll leave these up. People can look through. No questions. Thanks for sharing. Okay, well, if we have no further questions, I will end the webinar period, and I'll stick around here for a minute if anyone wants to ask any specific and direct questions. Thank you for coming.